Good morning. It's February 25th, 2022. Welcome to Triggered. I'm Cory Morgan. This is the Western Standards Live Daily Show. We come to you Monday to Friday at 11:30 Mountain Standard Time, usually for an hour and a half or so. We have a couple of guests on. We have interaction. We talk. I rant about current issues, of course. It's a good daily dose for a lot of Albertans to catch up and Westerners in general, as we see from Peter Petrovsky commenting from Ontario, Canada. It's the great thing with these new media these days, when we can set up and create a broadcast that can get right across the country like this, as opposed to the old days when you had to have some giant government institution like the nasty old CBC in order to deal with these things. So those comments are great. Keep them coming. Keep them civil. Something we got to watch for us. Hey, real Canadian girl in Lethbridge there is we do want to avoid some spamming. Some people have really been blasting a lot of links up on the comments stretch and things like that. And we want some discourse. We don't mind sharing some information, but if links keep getting plastered up there, it'll trip the algorithm and you'll get shut off from commenting. So just to keep that in mind. But throw forward questions to myself, to my guests, statements, tell us how we're doing. And we'll see if we can get them up on there. I got a packed show today. I got Franco Terrazzano. He's on quite often of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. We got Edith in Nova Scotia. And he's going to be talking about the BC budget and some of the crazy stuff going on. Members of Parliament are getting raises. They're getting richer while we're all suffering. Then there's going to be an interview I did have. We could only capture him just before, but this morning I spoke with our Alberta Finance Minister, Travis Toews, about the budget. We've balanced the budget in Alberta for the very first time since 2008. That's a long time. But it's certainly good news. But of course, if people remember the old bumper sticker that used to go around with Alberta saying, "Oh God, please let me get another oil boom. I promise not to piss it away this time." Well, we do that every time. We'll see if the government is responsible with this boom right now, and hopefully we'll all pay off with it later. And we've got people from across the country today. Sarnia, great. Sarnia is dealing with Line 5, speaking of energy security and fighting with the governor down in it's Minnesota, isn't it? Yes. Either way, they're trying to shut down Canadian oil getting across into there. There's a lot of threats going on. St. John, New Brunswick. Wow, we're all over today. Thanks, guys, for tuning in. So I'm going to get on with things. I also have, after the finance minister, BC tax and wealth strategist Mike Sidhu, and he's going to talk in on inflation and its impact. So it's a big financial packed show today, but these are important. Michigan, thank you, Shirley. I don't know why I was slipping on that. I've written enough columns on it. I should know better. So I count on you guys to help me out here. So let's talk about some other news besides the financial stuff, though, that has got me triggered, concerned, worked up today. Basically, welcome back to the Cold War. I grew up in the tail end of that prolonged, tense international standoff, but I remember it very well. My parents, of course, could relate to the terror living under the constant threat of nuclear attack. Most of us have seen the imagery of those drills with school children having to crouch under their desks in case Russia was about to launch a nuclear missile strike. I think even a kindergartner would know just how little protection a school desk would provide if there was to be a nuclear war, but I guess they had to try to do something. It must have been terrifying. The risk of nuclear war wasn't as acute in the 70s and 80s, but we always knew it was there. It was a favorite subject of high-tension drama movies, and there was no end to the novels set in dystopian post-nuclear war world scenarios. Every town had an air raid siren for those of us my age. You remember, we always had them. They were always there. And it wasn't the top of your mind, but you could never forget any time as well, you could suddenly be vaporized if those missiles launch. Cooler minds are prevailing right now, and while the world's enraged and horrified with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, no leaders or nations, thankfully, are threatening or planning to enter a direct war with Russia over it. So while sanctions have a limited impact at best on Putin's plans, they're still preferable to entering in what would quickly turn into a third world war. We just don't want to see that. As horrible as it is in Ukraine, we do not want to see a big world ground war going on. So now we're entering the long game, and it's going to be reminiscent of the Cold War. We have multiple world superpowers, all intense conflict, and all capable of nuclear war. Now, while I doubt the threat of a nuclear strike is imminent, we're now closer to that kind of mutually assured destruction than we've been in over 30 years. What we're likely going to be seeing is an increase in espionage-related incidents and cyber attacks between nations, border skirmishes perhaps in Eastern Europe, along with heated exchanges and ongoing tensions between world leaders. Proxy battles are probably going to develop again as the superpowers use smaller nations in order to fight their battles from. That's what they did in the Cold War. What would have been smaller civil battles, civil wars, would turn into lasting civil wars as foreign powers pump arms, funds, and training towards the faction of their preference. I had the opportunity to see this firsthand in Guatemala in 1989. That country was racked in a civil war that lasted from 1960 until 1996. The Americans supported the government, while the communist nations supported the guerrilla forces. The government used death squads to keep civilians compliant, while rebels slaughtered anybody thought to be complicit with the state. It was such a beautiful country with fantastic people and abundant resources when I went there. But what I also saw, of course, was rampant poverty, fear, and dysfunction. Couldn't even go to a bank without an armed guard, and the bank had a machine gun nest outside of it. It's unlikely that that war would have lasted the nearly 50 years it did without the Cold War feeding it. And it's no coincidence that that war ended within a few years of the collapse of the Soviet Empire. This situation was repeated throughout Central America and around the world, as superpowers used developing nations as their pawns rather than putting their own troops at risk. Now, while the Soviet Union and the United States never formally engaged in a war, their Cold War caused death and misery for millions of people for decades. Now, thankfully, again, there's no appetite for open-pitched battle between Western nations and Russia. I do fear, though, that we might sink yet again into another Cold War as these nations try to battle in other ways. In fact, I don't know how we're going to avoid it. As Russia settles into Ukraine, nations won't quickly accept this status and just let it go. They're going to seek indirect ways of retaliation to put pressure upon Russia. It all sounds chillingly familiar. After 2 miserable years of the pandemic, I've been looking forward to a world recovery and hopefully, returning some sort of normalcy again. Now it appears we're moving out of one long crisis and right into another one. It makes it really hard to maintain faith in humanity at times. I swear, it just seems that we don't like living unless we're at each other's throats. Time will tell. Let's try and maintain some optimism, but I got a feeling we're in for a long, very different world coming up ahead of us now that Russia has invaded Ukraine. Now, let's check in with our news editor, Dave Naylor, and see what's happening a little closer to home or perhaps in Ukraine. How's it going, Dave? Just going to get your sound up there. It's just going to take a second. No, I'm afraid I don't. I can hear you through the wall. I can read your lips a little, but we don't seem to have sound going on quite yet.
Oh, sorry about that. It was on my end, my fault. Not Nico's fault, my fault.
Okay.
Happy Friday, Cory.
Yes, thank you. It's been a long week.
Hey, did you happen to catch John Kerry on BBC yesterday?
No, I didn't actually.
Well, he's the former U.S. Secretary of State and now in charge of climate change for Joe Biden. And he was interviewed on BBC about Russian invasion of Ukraine. And you know what he answered? He was worried about what it's going to do to climate emissions. I guess these big, heavy tanks spew up a lot of fumes. So he's worried about that instead of the countless lives that are being lost and a sovereign country being invaded. So our columnist Mike Thomas tears them up a little bit on that one. That's on the website right now. Speaking of the Ukraine, we have astonishing video of a poor guy driving along the streets in Kiev, and he's run over by a tank. Literally squashed underneath the belly of a tank. And he survives. They cut to it and he's being cut out of the wreckage. It's a bit unclear who the tank belonged to at the moment or whether it was deliberate or slid into the vehicle, but really incredible footage. And I urge everybody to go and take a look at that. Other stuff that we've got on the go at the moment. Edmonton police have released a sketch of a knife maniac who stabbed a father as he was walking with his 2 young children along Jasper Avenue up in Edmonton. A story about bureaucracy gone wild. There was a TV station in Kitchener, Ontario that did a story on a residential school, and the anchor slipped up. And instead of calling it residential school, he called it a residential camp. A single viewer didn't like that and complained to the broadcasting standards people who launched an investigation. And yes, the TV network has been censored for their slip up, saying if journalists can't be getting to trust their words, then no one can, because words is our business, Cory, as you know. The Freedom Convoy, if you had a bank account frozen because you donated $20 to it, chances are it still may be frozen. The Senate heard that yesterday from a federal regulator. Canadian lawmakers, as Canada's got the third biggest Ukraine population outside of the Ukraine, and there's a lot of MPs and senators who are descendants from Ukrainian immigrants. And we've got a story on their emotional comments yesterday in the Senate and the House of Commons on how it's important not to let Putin win. We've got a column from one of Franco's colleagues, Chris Sims, out at the British Columbia Taxpayers Foundation. Interesting story about an Alberta man that has been slapped with a very unfair BC tax bill. That's a very interesting read. Dave Makachuk has also got a column on the heartbreaking scenes across the Ukraine. So that's what's up there at the moment, Cory. Our reporter Amber is working on a very interesting story at the moment on a couple in Ontario. Mother didn't want the kid vaccinated. Dad did. A court justice in Ontario has ruled on the side of the mother. Unusual. Most court rulings have gone on the side of the parent who wanted the child to get vaccinated. And the judge has some very, very interesting comments. So that'll be coming up shortly. So people can look for that on the site, Cory.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to those news updates and seeing them as they're coming up, Dave. Thank you very much.
You bet. Have a good show.
Great. Thanks. So that's that reminder. Yes, a lot of news stories. They're breaking everywhere from Russia to Ontario with that court ruling to here in Alberta. So be sure and remember, take out a subscription. This is how we can do it. This is how we can stay independent. This is how we make sure we do not we will never take government dollars. That's been well established here. Derek's always been clear about that, and we're all very supportive of it. But we do rely on you guys subscribing so that we can keep carrying on as we have. And you've been fantastic. We've got lots of subscribers. They're coming in more and more all the time as people get tired of the legacy media. If you haven't subscribed already, though, get on there, westernstandardonline.com/membership. You can try it out for free for 2 weeks. Hey, no risk. You think it's worth your while after 2 weeks, you can maintain it. $10 a month or $99 a year. And hey, if you put in the coupon code TRIGGERED, you'll get another $10 off. This is a good deal. Check it out. Put in TRIGGERED if you're signing up. You'll get a discount. And like 95% of those people who try the free trial stick with us because they realize it's the best $10 they could possibly spend. I'm going to run a quick ad from one of our sponsors here, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about the news before Franco comes in here.
Algodex is owned by Algonaut. This is great new technology just coming online now in the digital currency world. Algodex is a great way for you to use the digital currency Algorand in your day-to-day transactions. Can you imagine a world where we don't have to buy a cup of coffee using the federal dollar? And you don't even have to use the American federal dollar. You don't have to use the euro or the pound sterling. You can use real money, digital currencies that are not at the beck and call of governments and inflation. The Algodex is making digital currencies usable in a day-to-day basis.
Yes, digital currencies, we talk about those a lot. And, we're talking about a lot of financial issues today. As Dave was talking about, the people still have their bank accounts seized right now. I mean, look at the absurdity of this. I'm certain the courts are going to be going over this for, unfortunately, the speed they go for years. But I mean, if you made a $20, a $50, donation, and suddenly you're going to have your accounts frozen for an interminable amount of time, look at the damage that's doing to some of these people. How do you pay your mortgage? How do you make your car payments? If you've been separated, how do you pay your child support? This is huge punitive measures against somebody who just innocently donated to a protest. I mean, despite what some others are saying, it was definitely a peaceful protest. There was civil disobedience. They broke the law being parked there and things like that. But people weren't donating to a terrorist movement or an insurrection to take over the government. It's crazy. And now that precedent's been set, this is when, you might want to start making sure that not all your eggs are in one basket, and you consider things like digital currencies to hedge yourself against those sort of incursions from the federal government. And boy, they're getting bold with what they take. I read that court ruling that Dave was talking about, and it was unusual. And what was really interesting, and Amber's going to have that on the site pretty soon, was this judge. He didn't just rule in favor of the parent who chose not to vaccinate their child, but he ripped into it. I mean, the text from his ruling was fantastic. It was almost a column on its own. This judge was very upset with people basically being pushed around for their political differences and views. It wasn't going into the health issues. The bottom line is it's, parental choice, their ideas. And I guess it sounds like some of the stuff came up in the courts that, one of them might be politically supporting the wrong party. And this infuriated the judge. So do watch for that story, because it's refreshing to see a justice stand up and break from the ranks and say, hey, this isn't the sort of thing we're supposed to rule on, and this isn't what we get in the middle of. It's going to be a very good story there. That residential school thing, talking about independent media, that one's already up on the Western Standard. I went and looked at that story just before the show started here. And it's crazy. I mean, this is how bad it's getting. And again, this is why independent media is so important. We're not part of the CRTC. We don't get spanked and slapped by these regulatory groups. Though the government wants to come after us, don't forget C11. That's the next big battle. They want to take publications like the Western Standard and either shut us down or tell us what to say. We're not going to do that. Just that reminder for people, if you're watching us on YouTube or Facebook, that's great. But I do suggest people get over to Rumble. We're on there as well. We streamed all of them at the same time. And that way, if Facebook, we can't rely on these guys necessarily, or one of the others decides to punt us, you can still catch these shows. And yeah, some little slip of the tongue to refer to a residential school as a residential camp. Big friggin' deal. Well, this caused one single complaint, and that's all it took. And the Broadcast Standards Council gave them a slap on the butt for it, said it demonstrated the lack of necessary respect. Really? I mean, this is, just ridiculous. How are you supposed to move as a broadcaster if that's what you're stuck by? But that's what we're talking about. That's part of why we put this show together. I grew up on talk radio. I grew up on some nice edgy hosts getting in there and digging into tough issues and not being afraid of being a little controversial, not being afraid of breaking away from the mainstream view. And now you listen to talk radio, it's boring. It's dull as dishwater, because those who remain in it, they might be good hosts or were at one time, they're terrified. They make sure their show is as vanilla as possible so that they don't end up getting canceled or shut down like so many other hosts and shows out there have already. It's just trash. So it's not even the bias you're talking about. We're just talking about the boredom. They won't rant. They won't, cut in on an issue, put out a point of view. And if that's the case, then I might as well just read press releases. Just follow the party line. And that's where we're at right now with these things. And it's not a good place for media. So let's see what else we've got going on the news. Franco should be here any moment now. Yeah. Oh, yes. It's interesting when John Kerry was the one that Dave was talking about, who's up and worried about climate change rather than actual damage on the ground and wars. If you do recall, John Kerry got his start as, I believe, an anti-Vietnam protester. I could be wrong. This is going, before my time. But I think he was one of those veterans. He did serve his time in Vietnam, but then came back and protested against the war itself. So this is a man who should understand that the bigger issue with this war isn't the climate change, the increase of diesel from the tanks or the explosions. It's people getting killed. It's homes getting blown up. It's a country getting taken over by an authoritarian regime. I see some of that discussion going on with people saying, it's kind of gross seeing some people parroting Putin's line, but whatever. He's not liberating Ukraine. They don't want to be liberated. Yes, I've seen some, I guess you could say Putin fart catchers out there saying, there was corruption going on in the Ukraine. Well, welcome to Eastern Europe. That's every country there, but they still have a great deal more independence than they ever had under the Soviet bloc. That was a sick, sick regime. And there was corruption then. I talked earlier about my having traveled to Guatemala. I also went to the Soviet Union in 1987. And I tell you, that's not a world you want to live in. Russia is a grand, giant, fantastic country with some unique people is the best way to put it. They're tough, they're strange. But to get that empire going again, that authoritarianism in Eastern Europe to those independent states is wrong. It's wrong on every level. You're concerned about corruption within Ukraine, report on it, talk about it, take it to other international groups and commissions, but you don't invade them. There's no excuses for that. There's no reasoning. So sorry, Putin is on the wrong side of history here, guys, and there's no defending what he's doing over there right now. And as Dave said, there's some interesting videos out there. The one that was posted he talked about is good because a person came out of it unharmed. There's also going to be some awful videos out there too. So that one had a good ending. Be careful though when you're looking. We're getting live streamed war like we've never seen before, and there's going to be some pretty traumatic scenes out there. So moving away from that, let's get to some domestic talk and bring Franco Terrazzano. He's the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation on. He's been on the show a number of times before because there's always money things to talk about. How's it going, Franco?
Hey man, I'm doing well. Thanks again for having me on.
No problem. So we've got budgets dropping all over the place. It's that time of year, I guess. Alberta's got theirs. I'll be talking about that later. Federal government will have one, I imagine, sometime soon. And BC just went through theirs. That's where we'd like to begin here, though, eh?
Yeah, that's right. I was actually shipped out back out west to Victoria to cover the BC budget, which just came out on Tuesday. Cory, all in all, a failing grade from the Taxpayers Federation. That's what we're giving the government of BC, an F, and we're doing that for two reasons, Cory. Number one, there's absolutely zero plan to balance the budget. No timeline, nothing like that was in the budget. And number two, they could have balanced the budget in 2021 if they just stuck with their own spending plans that they had in their last budget, but they couldn't even do that. They went over budget, and that's why you still see a deficit in British Columbia in 2021. And of course, another deficit means more money that has to be borrowed, which means more money wasted on interest payments.
Yeah, well, it's something we pointed to a lot in the past was BC quite often used to spend less per capita than Alberta, at least.
Yeah, significantly less. Big time less.
They have more revenue challenges, I guess, to a degree, so it still leads to problems balancing their budget at that point.
Well, the biggest issue right now that we're seeing from the British Columbia government is really just a lack of prioritization across the board, right? Like I said, if they just stuck with their own spending plans that they created for themselves in their last budget, it wasn't like it was the CTF's budget plan. If they just stuck with their own spending, they would have balanced the budget in 2021. So we did see a smaller deficit than expected in 2021 in BC. So I guess, hey, a smaller deficit is better than a bigger deficit, right? But there shouldn't be a deficit at all. If they just stuck with their own plans, they would have balanced their budget.
Yeah, well, and one of the areas that BC's had for quite a long time has been their carbon tax. We've been critical of them for quite some time on that. There's no indications of tax relief coming in BC anytime in the near future or anything like that either.
No broad-based tax relief. And Cory, you're right when you talk about BC's carbon tax. I know in Alberta, one of the the big issues is the federal carbon tax. Well, the birthplace of the federal carbon tax isn't Ottawa, it's Victoria. It's British Columbia. That's really the model that the federal government has been using. Now, in British Columbia, though, we have seen that their carbon tax has been the highest in Canada for years. But despite having that high carbon tax, we see emissions continue to go up in British Columbia, right? So that really just goes back to this whole point that the carbon tax is really a tax plan. It's not an environmental plan. Of course, we saw during the first year of the federal carbon tax, emissions went up across Canada as well. And Cory, as you know all too well, when we talk about the environment, we have to take a global approach. And Canada only makes up about 1.5% of global emissions. So even if the federal government brought all of our industries to a screeching halt, it would cause a bunch of pain. But even then, it still wouldn't do much for the environment.
No, but the federal government does sometimes seem determined to bring all our industries to a screeching halt anyways. I mean, that's the main point that it has to keep going. We can't pretend that a carbon tax hasn't been tried. We can't pretend that it's just come in. It's been in place for years in BC. And if that basis for having one, if that justification for it was real, they would have had lowered emissions by now.
Yeah, emissions continue to go up, though, Cory. Lighter wallets, higher emissions. Cory, and I just want to circle back to the BC government's budget just for a quick second, because you kind of asked, like, well, where the problems are. And I want to really talk about the overspending. Now, I've been getting a lot of questions from many different people saying, well, hold on a second there, Franco. I mean, pandemic, there was flooding in British Columbia. So maybe a deficit is warranted in 2021. But again, we have to go back to the fact that if the BC government just stuck with its own budget plans, there would be no deficit in 2021. And that should have been doable, because even under those spending plans, Cory, they were still spending about $10 billion more than normal years. Now, if we look down the road to about 2024, they're going to be spending $15 billion more than normal years of budgeting. So what that tells us, Cory, is that they have no plans to balance the budget because they want to use the fog of COVID-19 to go on a debt-fueled spending binge.
Well, and I mean, most places are starting to realize that, that this is endemic. It's not going away. We've got to start looking at the long plan. COVID-19, the pandemic, may indeed keep costing us extra money, costing extra healthcare expenditures, but we got a budget for that, not use it as an excuse just to go wild and talk about this as a crisis that's going to rise and drop sometime soon.
That's absolutely correct. That's absolutely correct. It's one thing to focus your resources on an issue that is really pressing, but it's another thing, and it's completely wrong, to just budget like you want to spend more money on everything forever, right? That's not really budgeting. Families, businesses, they know that's not sustainable. But not only are we seeing that in British Columbia, of course, we're seeing that the federal government as well. Now, let's talk about one of the good provinces that we're seeing fiscally, New Brunswick. We're actually seeing New Brunswick starting to reduce its debt because it's accumulating larger surpluses. And what did New Brunswick do? Well, New Brunswick did prioritize spending on the pandemic, but it held the line on other areas of the budget. And that's something that we should be seeing across Canada, similar to that, right? I think families understand that if you have a leaky roof, fix the roof, but don't go blow money with your credit card on a flat screen, a few ATVs and a couple BMWs, right? Well, that's exactly what the federal government is doing. And that's similar to what's happening in British Columbia.
Yeah. So are you still out there right now?
No, I'm back in Ottawa.
Oh, okay. I was just wondering, so what are the gas prices looking like at the pump over there right now? Did you get a chance to see any of those? Or I know they're always horrific.
It was like a close to $1.80. $1.80.
Oh.
Yeah, it was absolutely crazy. I was talking to a cab driver about that, and it was really unimaginable. I'm in Ottawa right now. It's around $1.50, I believe, last I can remember, which even there is quite high, Cory. I mean, we've been dealing with these sky high gas prices, since about Thanksgiving weekend. So it's absolutely crazy how people are getting soaked at the pumps. And what's so unfortunate is that Ottawa is making these tough times tougher. We got a carbon tax hike right around the corner. April 1, the federal carbon tax is going up. And while Ottawa is raising taxes, you have a number of other countries that are providing relief. You have South Korea just reduced gas taxes by 20%. India cut gas taxes as well. You have countries like Spain, like France, that are reducing their electricity tax bill or taxes as well.
Yeah, it's saying quite something when Italy and Spain are the ones leading us in responsibility and tax reduction. Maybe Greece will be passing us pretty soon on that front. So pivoting on to the federal front, you'd written a column recently on that, and we've got, they seem to be doing okay through this crisis, federal employees, members of parliament and such, huh?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I mean, over the last 2 years, the decisions made by those in power have been full of pain. Right? Tax increases, revolving government lockdowns. But I think we need to call a spade here. It's pretty clear that those who've been making those decisions that have been causing a ton of pain have shielded themselves from that pain, right? Our wallets are getting lighter because taxes are going up, because inflation is going up. Well, it seems like people in Ottawa are doing pretty good right now. You've had members of parliament that have taken 2 pay raises during the pandemic. They're scheduled to take their 3rd pay raise in about a month. You have more than 300,000 federal government employees that received at least 1 raise during the pandemic. If you add provincial employees on top of that, the number goes up to over 500,000 government employees that received at least 1 raise. And Cory, not a single federal or provincial government bureaucrat has received a pay cut during this downturn. So you have the people who are in power making the tough times tougher for the private sector. But I mean, hey, they're not really being impacted at all from any of this.
And what was it in your column? I'm sorry, I'm just going on memory here. I read it earlier this morning. Something about CERB payments potentially going to businesses in Ottawa or something like that.
So that wasn't in the column, but this is something that you and I have been talking about offline. So Ottawa announced that there was about $20 million announced for the businesses that decided to shut down during the trucker convoy. And there was another group, one from Vancouver, who I debated on radio, who's calling for CERB payments for the workers. of those businesses that shut down. And Cory, I mean, we really feel for the many workers and the many businesses that have been taking it on the chin over the last 2 years as governments have forced them to lock down. But we don't think that taxpayers should be paying any more money for these CERB-like programs to the businesses that decided to close down in Ottawa, right? I live right on Rideau Street. I work right by Parliament Hill. So I was right in the middle of the trucker convoy. And I can tell you that there were many businesses that decided to stay open. And as I could see, it looked like many were very busy and they shouldn't have to pay a higher tax bill. So businesses like the Rideau Center could choose to close down.
Yeah, well, there's something of an irony there. There was one business that was getting in trouble because they had been serving some of the protesters. They had been open for business and trying to pay their bills. And then that was considered supporting the protesters. What a crazy time we're in. I mean, yeah, so we're looking at turning CERB. I mean, it's a different approach. I mean, if people start looking at this as something you can turn off again and on again and use in different areas, we're getting closer to a universal basic income idea, which is kind of scary.
Oh, it's very scary, and it's going to come with a huge price tag for taxpayers. And that's one of our key points that we were trying to make during this debate is, hey, look, we can't just have the government shovel a ton of money that it doesn't have every time something bad happens, right? Every time something bad happens, we can't just expect the taxpayer down the road, our own neighbor, to pick up the tab. And that's why we have been speaking against those types of announcements, and against the other groups have been pushing for more taxpayer money. And of course, Cory, we need to remember really the high level amount of spending that has been happening here. Already during the pandemic, the federal government has spent about $511 billion, nearly $500 billion, just on these lockdown subsidies alone. So we can't just have the Trudeau government continuing to throw out a bunch of our cash every time something bad happens.
Well, and speaking of that giant debt that's building up, there's been a lot of rumblings and talk. It sounds like we're finally going to start seeing some degree of interest rates, the prime rates rising from the central bank, and it doesn't sound like they're going to do a huge one, but it could be ongoing and constantly, and that changes the whole perspective for people holding any kind of debt, including our government.
That's correct. I mean, interest charges are already north of $20 billion annually for the federal government. Cory, we've talked about this in the past, but under the status quo, the federal government wouldn't balance the budget until 2070. And if those 5 decades of deficits come to fruition, taxpayers over that time would lose about $3.8 trillion. And even those estimates are really under relatively low interest rates. So, of course, I mean, what happens if interest rates tick up? What happens if Canada stumbles into another economic downturn? Of course, what we've been saying is that this low interest rate or easy money policy, overspending by the federal government, has really put itself between a rock and a hard place. And what we want to see from the federal government is one, I mean, just first and foremost, you have to rein in the unprecedented amount of spending and the massive government borrowing. And number two, provide some relief to taxpayers who need it. And that, of course, means tax relief.
Yeah, well, there's nothing worse than watching hard-earned tax dollars getting thrown away on interest payments. It's just money flushed down the toilet. And I mean, back in the 80s and 90s, it was just unbearable. And that's what kind of prompted us to balance our budgets for a while, but we slid right back into the high spending ways all over again. We just can't let people know enough how important this is and how awful it's going to get as interest rates rise and the debt builds up.
Well, that's exactly to your point what happened, right? 80s, you had these big spending politicians that kicked the deficit can down the road. What happened in the 90s? You even had places in Saskatchewan, closing down about 50 hospitals across the Prairie Province. So this is what we've been saying all along, is that you have to make some tough choices now before tougher choices are forced on you. And Cory, I just want to circle back to the budgets very quickly. The federal government under the status quo won't balance its budget until 2070. Cory, between me and you, looking at Trudeau's track record, I don't think the Liberal government is ever going to balance the budget. Now, we know at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation that is unacceptable. So we put in a in-depth budget report, budget submission. I spoke to the Finance Committee on it, but we showed how the federal government could return to a balanced budget in 2023-24 just by returning spending to pre-pandemic levels, which were already all-time highs.
Well, yeah, that's something I appreciate. Is at least we don't have time to go into it. I usually corner you on that where to cut, what can you do. I mean, you guys propose solutions as well as pointing out how you're going down the bad road. So I appreciate you coming on yet again to talk to me today, Franco. Where can people follow up and find more information on what you guys are doing?
Well, Cory, it was my pleasure as always, and please head over to taxpayer.com.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks, and keep fighting that good fight, and I'm certain we'll be talking again soon.
All right, sounds good. Until next time, Cory.
All right. Later, Franco. So yeah, the Taxpayers Federation never has a shortage of things to work on, that's for sure, with the way our governments just like to spend. I'm going to talk about a sponsor before we put on the recording of my next guest first, and that is the Canada Shooting Sports Association. These guys have been they've been sponsoring our show, and it's really important and it's helpful. I mean, not just the subscribers that help keep us producing this independent, unfettered content. Subscribers also give more viewers, and more viewers means we can sell advertising. And these guys are great. These are somebody you should join for your own sake. If you are a firearms user, owner, collector, you're a hunter, target shooting, any of those things, you need support. You've got to make sure you can maintain those rights. So if you go to these guys, they're an association, as their name makes it sound, Canada Shooting Sports Association. They have resources, everything from where there might be trade shows happening nearby to how to safely operate firearms on a target range. It's a great resource, a great spot. They need members. You got to take out a membership, because also what they're doing is they have multiple court challenges out on behalf of you, and they are standing up for your rights for your firearms, but they need your help. You got to get in there. You got to take out a membership so they can keep pushing that, because the Liberals are trying to take your firearms away. They're trying to take away your right to have and enjoy those legally and responsibly, as you already have been. So getting on with that, I had the opportunity this morning, just before the show, I interviewed Alberta Finance Minister Travis Toews, and we've had a lot of bleak financial talk so far, but it's something, at least out of this, is Alberta has actually returned to a balanced budget for the very first time in 12 years. So we're going to play that interview for you guys and have a little bit of an upbeat discussion for a change on here. So, great. Well, Minister Toews, thank you very much for joining us today. And it's for the first time in a long time we've seen a balanced budget. We've really needed some good news over this last couple of years. So I imagine it must have been nice to be able to present that yesterday.
It was a real pleasure. It was a privilege to present a balanced budget on behalf of Albertans. It's been, I believe, that Doug Horner was the last finance minister that ultimately balanced the budget in this province, and that's been too long. It was a real privilege to get to balance.
Great. So, I mean, it still, of course, raises a lot more questions now that we look in the longer term. Part of why the budget was balanced, of course, was some very high commodity prices these days, and we know those tend to go up and down. Is there plans, though, to moving? I mean, there were spending increases. We understand it's been a challenging few years, but moves towards fiscal restraint in coming years, so we can maintain these balanced budgets.
Well, absolutely, Cory. In fact, a big part of the reason why we're balanced in this upcoming budget is because of fiscal restraint. We inherited a government that was spending $10 billion more than comparative provinces. The cost trajectory was going up 4% per year. Had we stayed on that trajectory, we would have been showing a $6 billion deficit in the upcoming year. It was only because we've turned spending down. We've flattened spending, brought our cost per capita of delivering government services down. We've aligned it now with other provinces, which was a key fiscal anchor. And that's, again, a big part of the balanced budget story. I mean, you talk about higher energy prices, and, we're benefiting from those higher prices. But we're using, I would say, very modest energy price assumptions in this budget. We're using $70 for 2022, $69 for 23, and $66 for 24. So we're not, this isn't a balanced budget on $80 and $90 oil. This is a balanced budget on very cautious but credible energy price assumptions.
Yeah, and with those cautious assumptions and assuming things stay, though, as most people feel they will in the commodity world, there's probably going to be more surpluses to come in future budgets. What about debt retirement? I mean, we still have the debt now hanging there, and we're lucky that interest rates are low right now, but that won't last forever. Is there going to be a longer plan to start knocking that net debt away on us?
Well, Cory, we will develop a very comprehensive plan to deal with unexpected surpluses. Right now, we're projecting very modest surpluses, and I will say this: what we will do with a modest surplus is just reinvest that into the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. As you probably know, over the last number of years, governments have been pulling Heritage Savings Trust Fund investment income into general revenue. And the first thing we're going to do is stop robbing that Heritage Savings Trust Fund. Once we are reinvesting those earnings into the fund, at that point in time, we will consider our options and either debt retirement or further trust fund investments. One of the two or a combination of both. Obviously, we're going to have to consider our cost of capital, the time of debt maturity, and inflation rates, and a number of other factors. And I will be very interested in hearing from Albertans around that question.
Great. Actually, you got ahead of me there. I was going to ask if you were going to start putting money back into that Heritage Fund. Is there legislative controls or ways, though, that we could perhaps assure that, yourself or even future governments have to go through a bit more of a process before rating it, as we've seen in the past?
Well, absolutely. Right now, there is a fiscal rule. I think a very good baseline fiscal rule that requires reinvestment in the Heritage Savings Trust Fund up to inflation or CPI. So we've, of course, been following that, and the fund has been growing, but not growing in real terms. It's just been keeping up with inflation. We're going to consider fiscal rules for unexpected surpluses in the future. And again, right now, we would anticipate a combination of debt retirement and further investments into that Heritage Savings Trust Fund. One thing we will not do is open up the wallet and start spending irresponsibly.
Okay, and then on the other aspect, you get some more breathing space for perhaps some tax relief. A large part of the budget was balanced on revenue from personal income taxes, which is a good sign of a strong economy. But we do have that ongoing bracket creep going on. Is there plans to address that now that we're going into the future?
The answer is yes. We made a commitment to Albertans that we were going to pause indexation until basically we got to balance, till we got to a firm fiscal footing. And right now we're projecting a balanced budget. We're not there yet. As we work through the year, and as our price assumptions, economic assumptions, as we determine they're going to hold true, we will consider re-indexing for 2023.
Okay, and then it's an ongoing question, getting away from commodity dependency. I mean, again, it's not the whole basis of balancing the budget, but it's a large part of it. And we've been overly reliant, in my view, on it for a long time. So what sort of plans are there? It's always the economic diversity, I guess, that people are always chasing. What sort of plans have you got to get us so that we can start balancing these budgets without high oil prices?
Well, I mean, there's two things to look at there. I mean, realistically, there's your revenue structure as a jurisdiction. We have a very definitive taxation royalty structure in this province that ultimately generates revenues. And at some point in time, we've committed to appoint a revenue panel that would evaluate the appropriateness and structure and efficiency of our revenue system here in Alberta. We will do that before the end of the term. But the other way to create less volatility, Cory, and I think you're alluding to this, for government revenues, is to see more diversification in our economy. And from day one, we've been working to position the province for disproportionate investment attraction and economic growth. And that's happening. We've taken a broad-based approach. In other words, an approach that doesn't pick winners and losers so much, but provides a level playing field, which I believe will result in sustainable economic diversification. And we're seeing the investment pour into this province. We can look at the tech sector, the growth in that sector over the last few years. We can take a look at agriculture and agri-food manufacturing. Certainly the aerospace and aviation sector is growing. In the manufacturing sector is growing significantly in the province. Certainly we're seeing lots of announcements, multi-billion-dollar announcements around petrochemical manufacturing and hydrogen. So all of this is leading to a more diverse, less volatile revenue base for the province. So that has to be part of the plan, and it will continue to be a key plank in improving our fiscal sustainitability.
Great. So I can assume there's no plans to raise the corporate tax rate or anything like that, I imagine then.
Listen, Cory, we intentionally reduced our business tax rate from 12 to 8%. That's been a key ingredient in ensuring we have the most competitive business environment possible. We committed to that. We're going to stay with it.
Excellent. Just one area as we close up that was some increased spending, and I think people kind of expected it, though, was in healthcare. We're looking at, hopefully broadening our provision abilities so that we aren't as vulnerable when incidents such as this pandemic happen. Is that going to be targeted spending then to ensure we reduce the pressures on ICU and hospital capacities?
Absolutely. We're making a further investment in healthcare. We're increasing healthcare's base budget this year by 600 million. And no doubt there are pressures in the system, but the real focus is around expanded capacity. COVID has really demonstrated the lack of margin that we have in our healthcare system, the lack of surge capacity that we have in our ICUs, for instance. And so a lot of this investment is going to be targeted to strategic increased capacity in healthcare, including expanded ICU capacity.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Minister Toews, and I hope we can look forward to talking about balanced budgets for some time to come yet.
So do I, Cory. Thank you.
Okay, so that was a nice opportunity. I mean, we beat on the provincial government, we beat on the federal government, we criticized them quite a bit. So it was nice to get them on and kind of give a thumbs up for a change. Like, I understand it was still the boon of high oil prices that made balancing that budget that much easier. But we also know that it doesn't matter how high the oil prices are. If you're going to be irresponsible in your government management, you still won't balance that budget. It won't happen. I mean, if oil prices alone are what lead to prosperity, Venezuela would still be a very wealthy nation today rather than the basket case they are that we see, unfortunately. I mean, they've still got no shortage of oil over there, and a lot of the world wants it. But of course, their system is just such a catastrophe that they can't take proper advantage of it. So it was nice talking to the finance minister of Alberta there, Mr. Toews, and him giving us time. You know, one of the commenters pointing out, like, it's good seeing government senior members like that giving alternative media some time, and the Kenney government seems to be getting more forthcoming. I'm sure we're still going to be on their case on a lot of things in days going forward, but he answered a few good questions. I mean, I was wondering about the Heritage Trust Fund. You know, that was a real large part of the budgets in the past. We put a whole bunch of money into there. It was actually giving a source of annual government revenue that they could draw from that wasn't a taxation of the people on the ground source. And it helped them with their budgets. They couldn't resist themselves. They kept draining it and stopped putting into it. And it turned into a pretty small fund. But if they're talking about refunding that or putting money back into it, that's a good area, I think. I mean, Alaska, we've seen that. They set a lot of, non-renewable resource revenues and set them aside for the citizens for later. Norway did the same thing. We need to save a little bit of that money. You do it at home. If you're making more money than you're spending, you don't want to just keep spending it as fast as you're getting. You want to set some aside. At the same time, though, you want to knock down the debt. And he didn't give a good, solid, plan on where they're going to go and throwing money at the debt yet. But I would hope if we keep getting those surpluses, that is indeed where they're going to go, because the debt's the real big, long-term scary item that we have sitting there. So just that reminder as well is, he said at the end, and I wanted to ask, I didn't anticipate him saying anything else, but they're not going to raise the corporate tax rate again. And if you remember the first 2.5 years, basically, once the UCP got in, opposition leader Rachel Notley couldn't go a sentence without going on about her quote unquote $4.5 billion tax giveaway, $4.5 billion giveaway to corporate buddies, just on and on. It was like a broken record. Look, taxes that aren't taken, that's not money given away. See, she lives under that assumption that it's the government's money to begin with. It wasn't theirs to begin with. So the government taking less doesn't mean they're giving anybody anything. They're just giving themselves a little less. And there's no dumber way to try and spur economic recovery than to go after and attack businesses and corporations. Raising those taxes on those, that low-hanging fruit, because you don't have a face you can attach to them necessarily and such, only hurts you. That means they lay people off. It means they drop their investment. It means they move out of the area, the jurisdiction. If Notley had been in and still hiking those corporate taxes, we know darn well the budget wouldn't be balanced today. Part of what's happened, a large chunk of that budget, I looked through it. I mean, again, the oil and gas resources were a massive part of it. But the other part was it was personal income taxes. Why? Because Albertans have been out there and working and making money and paying taxes. And if you go attacking your corporations over and over, like Notley would really like to, people aren't going to be working. It's just the dumbest way to balance a budget is to try and attack corporate taxes. So getting a confirmation from the finance minister, they have no interest in raising those taxes again. That's good. Cheryl saying Edmonton's crying, it got virtually nothing from the Alberta budget. Yeah, I know. I mean, but your mayor, unfortunately, is a former Liberal member of Parliament, so it's never going to be enough money for him. Calgary's mayor is no better. She was at least sounding somewhat complimentary on the budget, but was talking about more. Not, the other part is, as I talked about with the finance minister, they're increasing spending all over. This isn't a austerity budget. They aren't cutting. They increased health, they increased education, the works, and still managed to balance the budget. So now I'm just hoping to see them actually start knocking down the debt. Use that surplus wisely. As I said at the start of the show, follow that old Alberta advice. We got the oil boom. Let's not piss it away this time. Okay, let's go to BC. We've got Mike Sidhu, who is a wealth and taxation strategist. And he works in BC, where if you really want to see where inflation and cost of living is a real factor, that's the place for it. So we'll bring him into the show here and talk a bit. Hey, how's it going, Mike?
Hey, it's going great, Cory. How are you?
Good to virtually meet you. Pass those Facebook messages to set this up. So I talked to Franco Terrazzano a bit earlier too on the BC budget that you guys have had come out, and another big deficit. The carbon tax is remaining out there for you guys. Your cost of living, I mean, boy, it's just through the roof out there, and we've got inflation approaching. We've got the bank looking to raise interest rates. I'm looking for some insight. What do you think we got to look forward to?
Well, it's interesting because I think you're seeing the federal spending with the Liberals going one way and the Bank of Canada trying to go the other way. Didn't Chrystia Freeland say in her budget update, whatever that meant, that she was looking to spend another $100 million on COVID relief? Well, in order to debt finance all of that, the Bank of Canada is going to have to come to the table and finance some of that debt. Now, on the same time, the Bank of Canada, who has bought billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of assets in order to bolster their balance sheet, most of that coming from federal bonds. How are they going to dump bonds in order to raise rates? For those of you who don't know, the way that a central bank increases or lowers interest rates is to either collect or dump assets. So if they're going to spend another $100 billion, Cory, Bank of Canada is going to have to get pretty busy in their balancing act of buying more $100 billion worth of Canadian government bonds, because I don't think there's another buyer on the market. And at the same time, dumping a net positive amount. So are they going to have to sell $150 billion of their assets and reduce bank reserves by that amount? It's going to be an interesting couple of years ahead of us, I think, for sure.
Yeah, and I think just it's too abstract for a lot of people, and I don't blame them, but they don't want to dwell on it. But the reality is going to kick us in the butt. I was kind of actually surprised with the way the world had hiked spending. I mean, Canada's not alone in this. They all borrowed, they spent, they essentially printed money. That the inflation didn't hit harder, to be honest, or more quickly. I mean, it's starting to catch up, and it's putting very real pressure on people. But it was slower than I would have thought it would happen to have been.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we come into the laws of. I'm a fan of Austrian economics myself. I like sound money. I like reserve-backed currency. Obviously, we're far beyond that now, but you see the average. And I was reading some statistics late 2020, mid 2021. I haven't looked at them since probably summer last year. Was spending, consumer spending. So when we see spending going into the market, the more that the consumers spend, the higher and more aggressive price inflation becomes. But when people are saving their money, we're staving off price inflation because nobody's spending it. They're just waiting. They're just on the sidelines waiting. We've seen price inflation in the stock market. There's no reason the stock market should be where it's at today. There's no reason that we should see the housing market. But of course, that's a municipal and federal problem. Municipalities not bringing more supply onto the market, and the federal coffers, just the spending that's going on by the federal government and money now in the system. When I've always said this, when you have an increased amount of money chasing a limited supply of things, what is going to happen to the price of those things as consumers chase those items, especially real estate, something tangible? We haven't seen. It's interesting. We could talk about silver and gold prices. Of course, that's in the tank, in my opinion, silver right now, and gold doesn't seem to be reacting to this inflation at all. But anyway, yeah, I agree. But I think it's more a sign of a lack of spending. Money is made by its volume and its velocity. So velocity meaning how quickly it goes through the system, and volume, well, we'll just refer back to our good friend Milton Friedman, who said inflation is an increase in the monetary supply and deflation is a decrease in the monetary supply.
Okay, so people are sitting on their assets. I mean, it's been unprecedented. It's unusual. People stayed locked in their homes. Disposable income, if you could call it that. They typically weren't spending it like they used to. They didn't go out to the theater. They didn't go, and those are big items. They add up on people. So in keeping those within the house, I guess it helps stave off inflation, but that's a terrible way to do it. I mean, we've been living a couple of miserable years. I mean, it's not a financial tool. That was just a consequence.
Absolutely.
So, and I guess that's why, I mean, typically when we get something like this, you will see precious metals, as people move towards a hedge, you would see them rise and spike. And yeah, they haven't really taken off as you would have thought they would.
No. And I'm to be clear, I'm not a bullion specialist, but the people who are in the know, that I rely on their judgment way more than me. They're predicting a slingshot effect with silver for sure. But I mean, if you take it, like going even back to base inflation, and when you take a look at food, fuel, housing, all those things that are generally excluded out of the general terms of inflation, the best way to avoid inflation is to change the definition of inflation. So the way that we define it today is much different than we have defined it, say, in 1980 or 1990 or anything like that. So,
yeah, well, and you got back to the bottom line of supply and demand, and pivoting back to real estate, because you guys have just been for people with a fixed or lower income, it's pretty difficult to break into that market over there right now. The municipal governments have been a large part of it. It seems to be these ideologues, these city planners. They feel that if they can just squash people into a dense environment, eventually somehow it'll balance itself. And all it really does lead to is a lot
just like
of
the budget, right?
Yeah, exactly. It'll balance itself. And I mean, in Calgary, though, we've been able to stave off that effect. What happened here is we ended up with a donut. The downtown is darn near empty because of all these efforts. What it did is actually make people retreat. And our satellite cities have boomed, while local development has actually slowed down in the city of Calgary, because we have the room, though, to escape and get out with our capital, with our feet, and move on. And actually, due to the pandemic, people are more inclined to. But in the Lower Mainland, you don't quite have that open, so much area to spread out and develop into. So what's a way, though, that they could increase supply to help mitigate some of those price spikes?
Well, certainly, there's a big part of me, Cory, that says our municipal councils, like what role do they play in limiting supply? And the human psychology is very interesting, right? So we always think about, well, why do people act in the way that their environment promotes them to act? And I think there's almost a monopolist type of, and I loved what you were saying earlier about, Notley, that it's not her money to begin with, and that's the big fallacy with leftist type governments, is that they believe that they are in control, that the government comes before the people, not people before the government, as it does in common law. So on one hand, Vancouver is the city proper of Vancouver has 0 building lots left. So there is the encouragement to talk about increased density, but in the outlying areas, for example, Surrey, Langley, Abbotsford, even going out to Chilliwack, their prices have risen at a faster rate than the downtown core. Not because the donut effect that you're speaking about in Calgary, but I think that's where people are generally gravitating to. New immigrants, certainly the Indo-Canadian population in that Fraser Valley area is very, very prominent. And a lot of the new immigrants are moving to that area, those Surrey, Langley, Fraser Valley areas. So we're seeing an extreme pressure. And Surrey, out of all the municipalities that I have been just observing, I'm not a real estate specialist, although I have my fingers in the pot in that industry, and just a lot of people that I, again, rely on for expert advice. Surrey seems to be very pro-development. Now, of course, they also aren't bringing that up with the right infrastructure. And where are these people going to drive? Where are these people going? How are they going to transport themselves? And that's the struggle, I think, is you've got either a pro-development. I'm in Victoria today. We've got a very pro-development council here in Langford, Western Communities, and a very non-pro-development in the core downtown. Victoria is feeling the brunt of the donut effect just as much as I think Calgary is, for sure. Add into that the living conditions downtown. You see a lot of for lease sale signs, for lease signs and for sale signs on commercial space. And the malls are empty. The downtown mall, we've got the Bay Center downtown, and that's maybe half capacity, maybe. Mayfair Mall, which is kind of not in the core, but a little bit out further, that's not at full capacity. We had a $500 million investment made in something called Uptown Center. That's at maybe, I want to say maybe even 40% capacity. That's really empty. And you've got one of the major leaseholds in there is Walmart and Whole Foods. But then the other major store that people realize is the Spirit of Halloween. So that's only temporary, right? That's only 2 months out of the year, but otherwise that space is empty. Anyway, so, from a municipal council side, when you limit supply, it's almost a protectionism mechanism that keeps the pressure on prices at an equilibrium based on what demand is. So, at fault, like I was saying earlier, municipalities for not encouraging higher density, for playing that devil's advocate game. They're in it. They live in those communities. They're preserving their wealth, just like any government who puts protectionist measures in their legislation also has a similar problem on the economic side of things, and they create monopolies in that way.
Yeah, and it was such a crazy irony, with real estate prices for homes and everything spreading out and getting so terribly expensive, yet central commercial real estate you can't give away these days, it seems. We got the same thing going on in Calgary. I mean, we've got over a 30% vacancy rate downtown. We're in downtown Calgary right now, and these buildings are it's almost creepy when you go out and see how empty they are. I mean, 30% is the official number. Realistically, I'd say it's closer to 50%, but a lot of people still have long-term leases, or companies do. And that's a real crisis in the making. I've got a guest on next week to talk about that.
Yeah.
These municipal governments have to pivot and understand that we need to decentralize populations. People don't have to come to these dense cores any longer to work. And if they don't have to, they're willing to move out, and that's what they're doing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The downtown Vancouver story is a little bit of an anomaly, because you've got Microsoft opening a huge downtown office. Amazon is opening a huge center right in downtown Vancouver, not as a distribution center, but as an administrative hub. There's a huge pressure even on commercial spaces in downtown Vancouver, but that seems to be a bit of an anomaly. You're not seeing that certainly here in Victoria, as far as what I have seen and experienced. I'm able to stand corrected if somebody's got different statistics on that, but certainly Vancouver just seems to be really weird. One of my good friends, is a commercial realtor specializing in downtown prices, and he said, yeah, prices are probably up about 20% on leased per square foot space.
Yeah, well, and we're in such unprecedented times. I mean, who would have ever imagined, well, what's going to happen to the economy and demand if we decide to quarantine and lock the population up for 2 years? Well, now we're seeing what it was, but how could you ever know? I mean, it's just so bizarre still, and we're adapting to it. I believe, our solutions, you and I would be among the same thing if you're talking Austrian economics. It's just get the government out of the way. People will vote with their feet, they'll vote with their dollars, and they will settle where it's sustainable. Just leave it alone. But when they keep trying to cork the bottle, they're just causing more damage, and it's just leaking out all over in an uncontrolled way anyhow.
Well, I would posit this. When was the last time we actually had real deflation in our country? I'll wait.
Deflation.
Deflation. When was the last time we actually had a deflationary correctioned economy that was protracted for a period of 1 to 2 years? Maybe 1982, but I don't really call that protracted. The problem is that we've had unfettered expansion, loose monetary policy, higher stimulus coming from either lower interest rates, manipulated interest rates, or manipulated monetary supply, which has propped up and I would argue since the beginning of the Bank of Canada, who was established as a response to the U.S. Federal Reserve Act in 1913, who was established for protecting the economy against really bad defaults in the banking system. And of course, now we understand that the Bank of Canada is the backstop. Not only are they almost essentially the exchequer, like in the British system, they clear everything on behalf of the banks. They provide reserves to the banks. And speaking of inflating the monetary supply, when the central bank, say, increases their assets by $1 million, well, what does that allow the banks to do is lend on that reserve and continue to multiply the value. So, the Bank of Canada, as we have seen in monetary, expansion of assets and then decreasing the assets of the bank, we've seen the M2 continue to go up, independently of where the Bank of Canada assets. You're going to have, smaller effects on that when the Bank of Canada sells off assets and reduces the assets on hand. But the impact of inflation is only there as a response to what the Bank of Canada has done. And it's permanent even after the Bank of Canada decides to do something else. So we've got a sense of permanency. I mean, you could go up, look up M2, M1 monetary supply. Fred is my favorite place to get it, the St. Louis Fred, Federal Reserve, because they've got the best statistics out there. Doesn't seem like we have really good statistical information, or we're trying to, pull the wool over the Canadian consumer's eyes on how much money really is floating around out there, which is all having a spiral effect.
Well, then another variable, Rothbard and Hayek could never have predicted it, is digital currencies. Just to throw kind of a curveball into it, though. I mean, this is something altogether new and different.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really not even a decade old as far as a factor, but it's turning into a very large one quickly. And that's going to have some sort of impact, but it's almost a crapshoot to try and guess exactly how that's all going to iron out in the end.
Man, if I had a crystal ball, we'd be having this interview. And instead of my office that I'm in right now in Victoria, it would be like Cayman Islands or something else.
I mean, if we could buy $2 Bitcoins a decade ago, we'd be all sitting well. But I mean, aside from Bitcoin itself, even, I mean, there's just so many of them. Some are coming, some might go. But they're I mean, El Salvador even actually embraced digital currency as their own national currency.
Yeah.
But I mean, we've got no precedent. Where do you go here? It's got to cause some distress in the markets, I guess.
Yeah, 100%. And where that's going to end up, I would love to pull certain people back from history and say, well, what do you think about this? Or what do you think about the effect of the World Economic Forum on the political spectrum for people that aren't around, who knew they couldn't even spell Klaus Schwab, let alone know who he was? Crypto, man, that has been the most interesting thing. And there's a lot of smarter people than me on this topic that are talking about what's going to happen, or is the U.S. Federal Reserve going to come out with FedCoin, or is the Bank of Canada going to move to digital currency, and therefore a guy that I like watching on YouTube from time to time is George Gammon, who's an economist, fairly Austrian, a little bit out there for some people, I think. But, what he predicted was federal digital currency will be the easiest way to usher in universal basic income, right? That's what I know for sure, is that when you just get a deposit in your bank, and if you don't spend it, then it's taken back from you. How else can you, what better way can you do to grease the wheels of an economy when you have a federally legislated crypto dollar that when you get universal basic income, you can't just save it and hold on to it for what Mises says is the motor of the economy is in saving, or Keynes said the motor of the economy is in spending. And even though John Maynard Keynes has been refuted time and time again, the political goal to be able to create the illusion of wealth, the illusion of success, is to finance your way through building a higher number on your balance sheet. But that doesn't, wealth is really production, right? It's how we can produce and use that production to consume, rather than just this nefarious amount of dollars that's just floating around. Just because my dad bought a house for $14,000 in 1970 doesn't make that house now worth $1 million in Victoria, right? The wood is not worth that much. The population hasn't expanded all that much. It's all circles back to spending, government spending, inflationary pressure by loose monetary policy.
Yeah, well, and some of that too. I grew up in Banff, and my father's still out in Canmore. And Canmore's really been kind of the expansion outside of Banff, because Banff's a national park. It's capped. But the battles now, every time there's a new district to be built, everybody who's got a place in Canmore fights it tooth and nail. They say, absolutely not. I got mine. Now I don't want anybody else to get theirs. And it puts of course, they don't want to. They know if there's a new development as well, their own property values could potentially, at least, if not drop, they won't grow as quickly. So there's unfortunately a consumer incentive for those who are already in to block others from getting in on that market, and that's sort of destructive as well.
Absolutely, and that circles back to the municipalities' vested interest in not expanding or bringing new developments online, or fighting it, or NIMBYism, not in my backyard mentality.
Yeah, and we're all paying the price for it. Well, I'll let you go. It was a very interesting conversation. There's going to be a lot to study and break down. As I said, there's just so many things happening now that we've never seen in human history. You talk about the Austrian greats, but they couldn't have foreseen this. As you said, if we could dig them up and hold a seance, they were brilliant people. They could probably come up with some things to talk about and examine this sort of thing. But unfortunately, we're left to modern interpretations on what may or may not happen.
Yep.
So
I'll leave you with this one last thought, Cory. One of my financial mentors, Nelson Nash, said he wrote a book called, he wrote a few books, but in one of them he talks about Willie Sutton. And Willie Sutton was a train robber. And so when he was finally arrested, they said, well, Willie, why are you robbing the banks and the trains and all that sort of stuff? And he said, well, that's because that's where the money's at. So when you talked about Rachel Notley coming after businesses because that's where the money's at, it just falls under Willie Sutton's law, man.
Well, I appreciate ending on that. Where can people find more information about what you're up to and what you're doing?
Yeah, social media. I'm on most platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and things like that. But a good website to catch me is ibcanadagroup.ca. It stands for the Infinite Banking Canada Group, which I'm a proud member and founder of that organization, which is a independent group of financial advisors from coast to coast that are focused on financial literacy.
Great. Well, thanks for joining me. I hope we can have the opportunity to talk again sometime soon down the road.
Thanks, Cory. Appreciate your time. Thanks for having me on.
Have a good one out there. So that was Mike Sidhu. And just a lot of economic talk. It's been a whole day packed with it. But as I said with Franco, it's budget season. And if I got the finance minister on the show, we might as well stick to that theme for a while. Getting back to the government and control. I see Cheryl commenting on the government will crack down and regulate digital currency because of money laundering. Yeah, potentially they're going to try. I think way back to, it would be the late 90s or so. I think it was the CRTC, and they put out a a study saying we've chosen at this time not to regulate the internet because the internet was just a growing thing. The reality was they didn't know how to. They wanted to control it. Oh, it was driving them bananas. Look at all these people daring to share information. They're actually starting to create marketplaces and trade goods. And we can't get our finger on that. We can't stop it. It's not like a newspaper that we can mandate, or regulate, or it's not like a radio station that we can choke off or force different types of content. And they're still trying today. They want it desperately. But it's like, putting the finger in the dike, and it just keeps spilling out all over the other places. And I think C11 is going to fail the same way, but they're going to put us under a lot of pressure, and they're going to do a lot of damage in their quest for control of individuals. And digital currency is similar. It's out of their reach, and they can't stand that. But it's evolving, and it's evolving fast. And for every one they might try to come after, 5 more spring up. And the people who provide the services for those digital currencies, as they said before, we don't maintain the money for these people. That's not our job. That's their money. We don't have that information. You go find them yourselves. So there's a budding means for people to get out of the reach of the government to a degree on these things. And it's driving them bananas, and they're going to try, but I'm not sure how they can stop this. But as I said, too, if a lot of people keep fleeing to that, it's going to impact markets in general and a lot of things. So we're in some strange times. I'm not going to counsel anybody on where they should put their money or shouldn't. If I was that sort of genius, it's kind of like Mike was saying, I'd be wearing tailored suits and some other things. But all the same, we're in some interesting financial times, without a doubt. As volatile as they are, we got new options springing up at the same time. Getting back to that, some of the things with control, we're hearing the Senate hearings, and they're still talking about things in the House of Commons. So there was a finance committee, and they were told that convoy cash was harmless. This is what somebody was telling the finance committee. Millions of donations appeared to be an honest outpouring of public support, the federal regulator said yesterday. They said outright it wasn't cash that funded terrorism. There we are. There's the story on westernstandardonline.com. I said it was their own money. And this is from Barry McKillop. He's the Deputy Director of Financial Transactions and Resource Reports Analysis Center. Big mouthful there. Said it wasn't cash that funded terrorism, and it wasn't in any way money laundering. There's going to be a lot of bloody lawsuits. There is. This government is not going to be left off the hook for the crap they've pulled. And they froze millions held in accounts that they suspected, Freedom Convoy sympathizers had donated. I mean, they're not just holding the amount that was allegedly donated. They're screwing with people's lives and holding their assets wrongly. And we're starting to hear some very candid discussion. This is part of why I think our imbecile of a prime minister did back off. There's the graphic from Nico. Man, he does great work there. And as you can see, we've got senior federal bureaucrats coming to Parliament, the finance committees, and hey, this wasn't a problem. This wasn't, illegal. It wasn't funding terrorism. This was wrong. This was wrong. And they're still frozen today. They're still frozen. Senators are asking. Senator David Wells in Newfoundland Labrador asked, and he says, I can't answer definitively. They've all been unfrozen. I suspect it's probably not the case. I mean, these guys don't even know when they're talking around each other. This is a big problem. We are in a bad period of time with our assets. And the more we can take on individual control, however that might be, it's going to be for the better. Getting the state out of our lives, out of our wallets, out of our investments, out of our real estate. But we're going the other direction these days, guys. I don't know. We got things that keep changing for the positive, and they keep changing for the worst. The government cracks down on conventional media. The media turns to crap. But guess what? The Western Standard springs up. Other ones like The Rebel, True North with Candace, Post Millennial, all those different publications are springing up. I was talking about the finger in the dike. So as much as the state keeps trying to control the information, we find ways around it. And we'll continue to. So again, I'm going to throw that reminder out there before we go into the weekend. Take out a membership with us, guys. We're going to have coverage of the protests going on. I believe Mel's going to go down there. I'm not sure. Calgary, the protests had thousands out there last week. We attended it. We checked it out. It was amazing. Peaceful, upbeat, thousands of people. And it didn't even get a mention on the mainstream media news. Really, one of the biggest protests in Calgary history almost, with volume of people, didn't even warrant notice, didn't get coverage. Well, we are not part of the mainstream. We'll cover it. We'll get on the ground. We'll do that. And if you get to the westernstandardonline.com, take out a membership, you'll get those stories that are behind the paywall, the breakdowns, the details on it. And the coupon word is triggered. Yes. Thank you, Lorna. That is the coupon code. So you can get a break trying it out, guys. Plus, it's a free trial for 2 weeks. So get on there, check it out, throw in the word triggered, and you will get that discounted membership to see that it's well worth your $10 a month to get that unfettered information. Give the middle finger to the old mainstream media. You don't need to follow those guys anymore. I still torture myself with it because I got to eat supper and I watch the terrible stuff on TV, but just so I can see what they're doing and what's going on in the issues. And then at least we can filter through it and give you guys better coverage. And we've got reporters across the country. We got a new person in Ottawa. You know, we're not just like some places they basically cut and paste press releases in there and throw them out there and have nothing but opinion content. We've got a newsroom full of professionals. Dave Naylor, decades in the business. Melanie Risden. Eva's been working at it. Amber's in Edmonton. So thank you all who've subscribed. It's really important. And again, subscribe on whatever platform for video viewing you're watching right now, so you can see these updates. They may live stream from the protests in person. We do that now and then. And if you've got, if you've subscribed on YouTube, Facebook, Rumble, you'll get the alert when one of those live streams comes in, and we'll get that direct coverage to you. So be sure to do that and share it. Nag your friends, get the other people out of the mainstream media, and let's talk directly with each other and fix this world up. We need to do it. Next week, it's going to be a big one. I got an interesting guy coming on. His name's Kid Carson. He's a radio host actually in Vancouver. I guess he was quite popular out there on a station, but he spoke the wrong way on the pandemic, and he expressed concerns about the government crackdown. So of course, like so many others, he got canceled, he got fired. He's back up, and that's what I'm talking about. We're flowing around it. You can't plug that dike. He's got a podcast, and he's talking, and he's got his viewer base, and they're leaving the conventional media. So that's going to be a good conversation. That'll be on Wednesday, I think. On Monday, I am going to talk to Dave Makachuk. Of course, there's going to be a lot more to break down on what the heck is going on in Eastern Europe with that terrible, terrible situation in Ukraine with Russia invading. We'll see what's come out of it, and we'll break that down and see what we got to look forward to. And it's going to be interesting. I'm going to talk to Jake Foster. And if you look on the Western Standard site, he's actually basically a sports writer, and he's been covering lacrosse. And professional lacrosse in Canada has actually been getting bigger and bigger with the Roughnecks and things like that. And he's directly in there and covering those guys. And, we don't need to pay for those top-rate NHL teams for entertainment. There's also some fantastic lacrosse games going on, some great athletes out there, some great competition. So, we don't always just talk about politics. It'll be a nice break from that with Jake, and that'll be a good conversation. So be sure to tune in on Monday, guys. We're going to kick off what I'm sure is going to be another crazy, busy news week. I thank you all for tuning in today, and y'all have a good weekend.